Hello and welcome to VistaTalks, interesting discussions with interesting people from all around the world. I'm your host, Simon Hodgkins, and I'm delighted to introduce Giulia Greco. Giulia is the founder of Giulia Greco Consulting. And look, it's a global strategy and language expert that we have with us today, deep experience in helping companies expand internationally, a topic we love. And I know you're also a bit of an insights globalization expert with Nimdzi. So it's great to have you on the show, Giulia. Thanks very much for taking time out to be with us today.
Well, thanks for inviting me. I'm delighted to be here and have this conversation with you.
Giulia, you lead your own consulting practice after years of leading language operations at companies like Shopify. That's a name that a lot of people have heard of all around the world. And it's an interesting move when somebody goes from, as we call it, client side to consulting with multiple customers. What was the catalyst? What made you start up your own sort of consulting business, Giulia?
Yeah, it is a massive change for sure. I when I left Shopify at the beginning of this year, I didn't see any particular roles in other companies that made me feel excited. And I need to work like most adults. And so I figured, why don't I try to do this instead? I was also coming from a feeling of burnout a bit, actually more than a bit, and being a little bit disillusioned with the corporate world and wanting to try my hand at working for myself. It's something that I've been wanting to do for a long time. And I also have a lot of friends and family members who have pushed me in this direction for a while, who have said, I think you should work for yourself. You have what it takes, blah, blah, blah. And so having sort of a network of people that care about me and believe that this would be a good fit for me was definitely part of that decision. And I wanted to have more control over my life. And I'm also the kind of person who gets, a bit like easily bored. And there was a moment a year and a half ago when I felt like disillusioned with my work and what I was doing. I felt like I was going in circles with the same problems over and over and over. And while it's true that when you work, probably in any field, but definitely in localization, we seem to be often talking about the same problems and how to solve them just in different settings and with different levels of resourcing and in different circumstances. Um, Working as consultant allows me to have a little bit more of a diverse breadth. And so the problems may be slightly different, the circumstances are different, the level, of modernization of various companies and teams is very different. And so it keeps it fresh and interesting for me.
That makes a lot of sense and a lot of reasons in the mix there as to why you set up Giulia Greco Consulting. And I know when you speak, you often speak about how companies that are looking to go global, that it isn't just about translation, right? You
Yeah.
you talk about understanding, maybe even more than the word translation. So could you maybe explain that a bit more, unpack that sort of philosophy or that way of thinking,
Yes.
and how does that shape the way that you're helping companies navigate international growth today?
Yes. So I'm going to be a little bit not politically correct right now. I hope that's okay. So I find that because I live in Canada, I work mostly with North American people and entities. And I want to say more American than Canadian. America tends to be a little bit English centric, not a little bit, a lot. Like there are many, many people that mean well, but they don't realize that the world doesn't necessarily function in the same way as what they're experiencing on the day to day. Whereas I find that generally speaking, in other continents, people are a little more exposed than used to a multitude of languages and diversity of ways of doing things simply because of the physical geographical proximity. Here we're dealing with a massive continent where everybody pretty much speaks the same language and the currency is the same. And even when you think about the difference between Canada and the United States, of course there are a lot of differences, but it's still called a dollar, even though it's a Canadian dollar. The sign is the same. So from a graphic perspective, it's not hard to understand. A lot of elements of internationalization and other matters are very similar. So you don't have that there's not that instinct in people that are making business decisions to realize that there's way more other than language that they need to think about when they're thinking about going international. And so there's a little bit of this blindness, for lack of a better term. And that's where people such as myself and my other colleagues or friends who my network who does what I do are instrumental in having this conversation and bringing this perspective of saying, hey, sure, you need translation, but you don't just need translation. You need more than that. There's a whole internationalization aspect to your product or company or service or feature that you need to think about, and that is more structural in nature. And then there's a mindset too, and there's messaging, there's voice and tone, there's brand, there's unique value proposition. All of these elements matter, and they're not necessarily related to translation. Anybody can just translate a website and put it up online and call it a day. Is that going to be enough to be successful? Probably not. So that's the whole point about understanding that there are so many nuances. And if you want to be successful as a company expanding internationally into a new market, there are many, many elements you need to think about. And language is just one of them.
Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. And obviously, when you're talking to lots of different companies now and advising them, you obviously have views on, I suppose, the importance of asking more strategic questions before people get into that internationalization, before people move into localization. Things like what content is essential, what maybe stays in English, to your earlier point. How does AI impact programs today? Are there some areas that you see companies overlooking a lot before they try to get into this translation or localization space, but maybe they're not asking the important questions up front?
It depends. I mean, I'm actually in active conversations with a potential new client, and this potential new client has a high degree of nuance already embedded in the way she operates and understanding what are the key types of content and the key pages on their website that are going to need to be localized versus what is a nice to have and maybe not really necessary, and we can punt it for another time, maybe never, depending on the circumstances. That's pretty rare, though. I found that generally speaking, the approach tends to be, okay, we need translations, and we just need to translate, and there's a whole like internationalization aspect. It's like, have you thought about your customer journey in another market? Have you thought about UX implications? Have you designed with a UX that's already a good fit for localization, or is this the first time you guys are thinking about it? So now we're going to have a problem from a design perspective that you're going to have to change your mindset. It's often a mindset issue. And then you have companies that are, you also have like more traditional companies in some of the regulated industries where, translation is already done. Quality is very important, but for example, they may be struggling with, bloated, bloated processes, bloated ways of thinking, like old fashioned. So, not a modern tech stack, maybe barely any tech involved, so that they're saddled with a lot of like manual, inefficient processes and workflows, and everything takes forever. And sometimes in these same companies, you have other departments that are operating at a completely different speed. And so these other departments are the internal clients of maybe, an internal translation service, and they may be frustrated. They may be absolutely thrilled with the level of quality that they're getting, but they're not thrilled with the turnaround times and the SLAs and the fact that it takes, 20 plus manual steps to get from beginning till end to get something back. And so that's where I contribute, I help in, modernizing this type of situations. And that's usually more of a mindset shift than anything else. It's not necessarily about what tools and platforms you're using. It starts with a mindset shift. It starts with recognizing that you have a problem, that you are inefficient, that you mean well, and yes, you have quality, but operating like this is no longer sustainable in this day and age. And this is what actually puts teams at risk, because teams that are not efficient eventually get on the radar of leadership, and it may not end well. So there's a lot of impetus to modernize and figure out how to incorporate AI because of this. It's not necessarily AI for translation per se, but it's AI to simplify or automate and help processes and workflows that may be bloated and too slow and too old-fashioned.
Yeah, and it's interesting as you're talking, because it kind of, a key takeaway for me is that before you get into the tools and the platforms and everything, there's some fundamental key questions that need to be asked first of
Yeah.
all. And you also talked about, the content and the prioritization, and that's sort of like a bit of a critical step, isn't it, in global
Yeah.
growth? So do companies make big mistakes here? Are you having to help people with that content prioritization, or do they know what they want?
It depends. It depends. Like, I mean, there are clients who are very clear in knowing what is important and what is not, and are perfectly fine with a phased approach. And then there are clients who are like, we just need translations, and they assume that everything needs to be translated, and they haven't really thought about their content as an asset, as a product. So in my mind, I think that content, written text, but also multimedia, of course, because we cannot forget about that. That's, it's also a type of content, is an asset, and you should treat it like a product, just like multilingual content needs to be treated like a product. And so the problem is when you find, uh, it's interesting. Different clients really have different mojos, for lack of a better term. It's like, I'm dealing with a client who thinks that translation is the ultimate goal per se, but they're not in the business of translation. They are in a regulated industry, but they have an internal team of translators, and this internal team thinks that the goal of what they're doing is, having beautiful translations. I'm sorry, but that's not the goal. The goal is the translations need to be at the service of the business. This business does X, Y, Z, and the translation are supposed to support X, Y, Z in that language. Then you have, people that, just want to throw spaghetti at the wall. And, they tend to be, maybe they're like startups or younger type of, less tenure type of companies where, enthusiasm is high, and it's great because it's usually like, it's fun to be in those environments, but there's a lot of like, just like, let's just translate everything, and the growth will come, more growth will come, which is like, yeah, of course, if you have nothing and then you provide something, the curve is going to be up and to the right, inevitably, obviously. But eventually you cannot operate like that forever because it's not sustainable. Even with AI, even if you're just translating everything with AI, and not even knowing what kind of results like what kind of quality you're getting back in languages that maybe are like, you cannot judge for yourself. And you think that it's free, eventually it's not going to be free. It's not really ever free. And is that a good usage of your time and efforts? it's important to be more strategic. And so having not just the content prioritization, but like your market prioritization, like what are your tier 1 markets? What are your tier 2? What are your tier 3? Do you have something that's ramping up and you're keeping an eye on? And so maybe, are you able to plan in that respect? And so you got content, you've got your priority markets. You have to think about what is your goal ultimately. Like, so yeah, you should, I try to start with like, what is your goal? Like, what are you trying to do? What is important right now? And then you work backward from there. And I also want to say, I strongly believe in like a phased approach. So it's not like all or nothing. It's like start, see how it goes, measure, allow for some time for things to develop and turn around and show some growth, see how it's going. And then you can have a phase 2 and a phase 3, etc. Like you don't want to go all in like immediately. I think that's a little bit risky, even though AI makes it sound easy right now, but you still end up having to, it's still work. Let's put it this way.
It certainly is. It's still work. It still takes a lot of human expertise too. And I wanted to ask you because, look, you've got a lot of experience, and you're still helping people build their localization or their globalization programs. But also, there's a bit of a differentiator between building a program that maybe supports growth or supports the requirement, and building localization programs that actually help drive the company, right?
Mm-hmm.
So a bit different from maybe a supporting role to something that's a key driver for the business. Is there any sort of approach or any thoughts that people should be, mulling over when it comes to ensuring localization success?
I mean, to me, localization is successful when your multilingual version of whatever it is that you have is performing just as well as the original, if not better. Ultimately, it's as simple as that. So, it's, I think that it is a little bit wishful thinking to think that localization can drive growth on its own. It's not a solo endeavor. It does require collaboration and many factors to be successful, but it is one of the factors that makes it successful. So if you are in a company and nobody's doing you know email marketing properly, and they haven't figured out their user personas, and they don't know how to do outreach, and they don't have a good sales team, but you're doing impeccable localization, is it going to be successful? Probably not. It doesn't matter how good localization, how good your multilingual website and content is, if you're missing all the other dimensions that contribute to growth, right? And so it's kind of like everything needs to work together like an orchestra.
I like that. Yeah, that's a great observation. Yeah, I like that, like an orchestra. And I wanted to talk about Bill 96, if I can,
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
because when it comes to global sort of compliance requirements, regulation, it's, I suppose, a more growing concern, but it's also maybe an opportunity for some businesses. Are you helping clients to stay compliant while you're still delivering that sort of creative, engaging, multilingual experience? Because regulation, Bill 96 being, part of that story, it's happening in lots of geographies around the world at the moment.
Yeah, something similar to Bill 96, which is the Quebec language law, for sure. So yes, I am helping clients with that. There's a lot of, generally speaking, I get asked about this a lot because I live in Canada. But I live in Toronto, which is Anglophone. It's not in Quebec. But because I'm here and I get around a lot and I talk to a lot of people, people are like, oh, she's Canadian, she'll know about it. I have a colleague in Nimdzi who lives in Montreal, and she really is the ultimate authority on these matters. I feel like a student when I'm talking with her, because she really is embedded in the world and knows it much more deeply and in detail than I do. But having said that, sometimes I do help companies with this, and if I need more help, I know where to go. I go to her or others. But it's as simple as knowing what the requirements are, what the regulations are, and explaining it to well-meaning people who are like, okay, I'm going to Canada. Do I need French or do I not need French? And it's like, let's talk about this, because there's a lot of nuance here. In theory, yes, Canada is a bilingual country. You can very well operate in some parts of Canada in English only, but if you are selling online, anybody can buy online, and so you are somewhat also targeting Quebec, and so you should have French, and it should be Canadian French. Now, Canadian French is not widely different than French from France, and so if companies are already translating and localizing in French from France, it's an easy lift. You can just adapt it very quickly. You can just, as long as you have an URL specific for Canada, you can just import all of your French content that you already have and then just do a little bit of like light touch localization that's fit for Quebec. Obviously, the internationalization is important because you're not going to show the euro sign, you're going to show the dollar sign and all of these other internationalization elements that need to go and need to be correct. Then I argue that it's a growth opportunity. So, if companies are interested and if they're just doing it for compliance reason, what I said should be enough. I mean, I went pretty fast. There's other elements, but the gist of it, you get it. But if you're actually targeting people that actually live in that region, it's worth really learning it and figuring out how culturally different it is from the rest of Canada and from the rest of North America, because it is very culturally different and there's a lot of nuance there. And so you're going to want to rely on hiring people that are local and are from there, who have all that expertise and can tell you this is never going to land in Quebec. You're just going to sound like another Anglophone and people are going to get annoyed, because they do get annoyed. You have to be it's a very sensitive topic, and it's also political right now. So it's a little bit tricky to navigate because, of course, you want to have respect for the language and for the feelings of people in a specific country always. Sometimes when these things get this type of topic, when language gets regulated, it can go a little bit too far in in its implementation. And so let's just say that sometimes it's a little bit loaded and you have to tread very, very lightly and diplomatically. Yeah.
Yeah. Great points that you make. And I suppose when you're talking about cultural differences and the importance of cultural sensitivities and treading that sort of fine line, it also makes me think about all the different teams and all the different departments of all the customers that you're working with, because a lot of people are geographically not located in the same place anymore. They may be working from home full time or part of the time. They're probably not even in the country that the company's operating from in lots of cases. So do you have strategies, or do you go about aligning those diverse functions around this sort of common vision, this common sort of internationalization view? You must come across this all the time, Giulia.
Yeah, I do. I mean, yeah, you make a good point. There's so many levels of dimensions that contribute to the diversity of any group of people and any person and any internal company culture. And so I try to understand, generally speaking, the company culture and what are the top 3 values that they uphold at all times. And then as a consultant, I align myself to that. So if I'm working with a client for whom quality is the number one priority and they all care deeply about quality, that needs to be my guiding principle. I cannot go and, even though they're coming to me and say, we want to modernize and we need to cut steps, so there's much manual work and we need to modernize and we're spending too much money. I'm like, okay, but quality is still your number one priority. So I need to keep that in mind with whatever solutions I'm going to propose. It cannot come at the detriment of quality. And that's where things get interesting, AKA difficult, right? Because, everybody can cut corners, and then the first thing that goes out the window is that quality. So you kind of want to realize what it is, the top 1 to 3 values that are not necessarily stated, they're not necessarily outlined in a mission statement and any documentation. You just get it by talking to people. So ultimately it comes down to what I would call the discovery phase, when you're having a lot of conversations with your client and you're just going fact finding, but also emotions finding. And, lately I've been reading about design thinking and how to apply those concepts into my work. And I find it incredibly useful because really it points me to think a little bit more like a designer, and which is something that I've always been interested in. So this is the luxury of being a consultant. I now have a little bit more time on my hands and I can pursue things that I enjoy just because, I enjoy them, and then I can see if I can incorporate them in my day-to-day. So sorry, that's a little aside from question number 1 that we had. But yeah, back to the topic. So trying to have that approach when you're doing some research within the environment that you've been called into, and talking to people, asking a lot of questions, observing the way they work, observing the way they interact with each other, the way they interact with me, and just being like very open. I tend to be a very open person to start, like as in what you see is what you get. There's very little filter. I'm very transparent, and I find that that's helpful because eventually people relax and they come back to me with their authentic self too. And that's key, because that's when the conversation gets interesting and I find out what it is that they're really struggling, what it is that they're really thinking. And so that's when you start building those bridges that eventually bring to collaboration. And another thing that I've always said is and I think I published something on LinkedIn about this at some point, where you have to become sort of an archaeologist of other teams. So even if you're not a consultant, but you're working internally as part of a localization team, a globalization team, anything like that, you end up having internal clients that are from all parts of the company. And so one day you're dealing with marketing and growth, and they're all creative and fun and scattered and fast. And the next day you're dealing with a lawyer who needs help, and they're slow and process oriented and, by the book. And so it's a very different, you have like internal cultures within the internal culture in any company. Each team has their own identity that's slightly different. And so when you work in localization, it's important to figure out the identity of each one of your internal clients and work with that. That's good intel that will help you be better at your job, because that marketing is going to come at you fast and furious with a last minute thing that they forgot, and it's going to need to be creative, but they're going to be more flexible because flexibility is kind of inbuilt in being a creative person. And that you have to operate in a certain different way when you're dealing with legal and procurement and finance, but also when you're working with product, when you're working with, engineers that want to understand the facts and the requirements in a very neutral manner. And, and also you cannot stop continuous development. That's the environment that you're in. So speed is a factor, and you need to be mindful of that. So you cannot go back to them and say, we need to review before you can launch. No. They can launch and you review after. That type of situation, right? Where you need the flexibility to understand that this client over here needs me to be this way, but that client over there, I can be in a different way because it's a completely different type of environment, and they care about different things. So having that flexibility and having that knowledge is absolutely key to being successful and also to get along with them.
That's a wonderful answer. You covered so many topics in that, Giulia. And like we started off talking about the sort of diverse teams and departments that you're pulling together, and the how that's sort of critical, but also understanding the what I would term the non-negotiables for a company. What are those sort of 1, 2, 3 values?
Yeah.
And that may not necessarily be what's stated and in a frame on the wall. It may be from talking to those people, but also then you sort of moved us on as well to really getting close to the key stakeholders and understanding that element. So thank you for that. Some great insights there. And look, we've got to talk about AI for a little moment anyway.
Right.
I think it's the law at this stage. You have to include AI in a conversation. But look, it is obviously reshaping the translation and localization world. But from your perspective, and the question I've got for you is there a way that localization people in teams or the localization leaders can actually plan and work better when it comes to AI's strengths and maybe some of its limitations that we hear about? Because it's changing as we move forward, isn't it?
Yeah, it's changing. It's changing while we're using it on a day-to-day basis. And that's, I think, the difficulty of talking about it is that, I'm hearing often people saying the AI that we're using today is at its worst that it will ever be. It can only get better and better. And I can see that already, because when I started using it, it wasn't as good as it is today. Like I started when ChatGPT came out. What was that, 2.5 years ago or something like that? I can't even remember. But anyway, seems like a lifetime ago. And it is so much better already. And so it keeps on improving. I think that it can be a game changer to augment and help, your day-to-day work, some of the annoying manual things that you used to do. I use it every day. I'm gonna be honest. Like, I don't think I could be, I went from having a big team to being a solo worker, like a solopreneur, so to speak, right? I work by myself and I have a lot to do. But like Claude and ChatGPT and Perplexity and Gemini and all the note takers, they're my colleagues, they're my team. That's my team. I'm like, I'm gonna make Claude do this, and while ChatGPT works on that, and I'm running this like, I don't think I could be as efficient and as effective if I didn't have these tools. So, I'm gonna be honest. And do I have mixed feelings about it? Yes, 100%. Do I feel bad about the environmental impact and other matters? Yes, I do. There are other things that we do that are not great for the environment, though. It's like, I find it interesting when people are talking about that as in like, oh my God, you're a terrible person because you're using it. And I'm like, well, do you take planes? Do you ever go on vacation or to visit some family far away? I mean, that's not great for the environment either, but like, you're still doing it. I'm still doing it. I want to go home and see my parents. I'm going to have to get on a plane. They live in Italy. What am I going to do? Go on a rowboat? Obviously not. So it's about like, trade-offs. I don't use it for stupid things. I use it for my work and what I need to do. In terms of the working world, I think that it's important. I think that a lot of teams are now using it intentionally to see where it makes sense to be used in a way that can help rather than become a hindrance or something that then needs to be redone. I also want to say there's a lot of, once again, I'm going to be controversial, but AI can translate really well. It really does. It really does. The problem is that it's not consistent. And the problem is that it does hallucinate. So just like humans, it's fantastic at making things up. And so it can very convincingly tell you this is a perfect translation, and you're going to believe it unless you have the ability of knowing that that's not true. And so it requires many more controls. But it does like an excellent, like, for example, I used it to iterate, to generate ideas for transcreation in Italian and then iterate on that. And obviously I was using my brain too, but it just got me started. It got me started with a number of ideas, and then I just used those as a base and worked on that. It is very efficient. For me, it works because I'm the kind of person who does her best thinking in conversation with someone else. And so I use that as my sparring partner to debate, to make my ideas stronger and better. Somebody whose brain may not work like mine may not find that useful, but maybe they find something else useful. So I think there's a lot of there's personal usage, and then at company level, it's interesting because there's this push to maybe overuse it, which is, a bit like used to justify cutting costs, including cutting human resources, aka people. Obviously, I don't like that. That is sad, and it's something that we as a society are gonna need to come to terms with and figure out how to solve for it. There are also jobs that are being invented as a result of this new technology. I think that ultimately people that are not afraid of learning new tools and new methodologies of work and tech and dabble with all of these new tools and technologies are still going to be fine versus people who are not interested, don't have the curiosity, or are not capable or able to learn some of these new technologies. I think that those people will be in real trouble if they want to work in certain environments. Obviously, if you are working in a completely different setting, there are settings that are not being affected, but they are very far away from the type of guests that you have here. I'm thinking a gardener or somebody, who lays bricks and builds homes, like that type of thing. Trades are pretty unaffected by this. But who knows? I don't know. I feel like I didn't really answer your question.
Well, you kind of answered it in an interesting way, because you started by saying about going from working with large department of people to being almost like a solopreneur when you start your consultancy business, but you're also back to that word orchestration, or you're sort of the
Yeah,
orchestra now.
yeah.
You're there at the control panel of all these AI platforms and tools, these
Hmm.
LLMs. And as you're saying, well, Claude's doing something over here for me, Gemini's working on that, and ChatGPT and Perplexity over here got something going for me. And you're kind of working that way. And you also talked about almost like a sounding board, or a sort of conversational sparring
Yeah,
partner to help you
yeah.
iterate and come up with ideation and things like that, which I think is great. I think some people are certainly benefiting from that. I think what also came across to me is that it's obviously improving productivity, but we also came back full circle to it can convince you almost that this translation is perfect when we know, an expert knows it's not, right?
Yeah,
And that's where I think, from our perspective, from VisTech perspective, I should say, it's about the human and AI collaboration.
yeah.
But you kind of echoed that in what you were saying. So I think it was a very good view on how AI is reshaping the industry, for better or for worse, but it's certainly improving in some areas. It's flagging issues in other areas. But one thing's for sure, we're certainly on the move, and we're definitely moving pretty quick. And it kind of brings me on to, I've got a couple of quick questions I want to squeeze in here, Julia.
Sure.
Obviously, we like people to choose VistaTech. That makes sense. But when you're sourcing talent, or when you're choosing a vendor or an LSP, or as we like to say, a global content solutions provider,
Hmm.
people need to have some sort of key elements, don't they? That whether they're a founder or a global lead or somebody in charge of the lock budget, that what should they be looking for? What should they be considering when choosing partners to work with, to make sure that they are successful in their efforts to go international?
Well, once again, it changes for everybody. It has to do with their requirements and their needs. You there was a point when I was at Shopify when, we were only working with direct freelancers. We didn't have an LSP at the beginning. And then eventually things scaled up to a point where we knew it wasn't sustainable to continue with the model, and we needed an established LSP that could grow along with us, that had capabilities to do things that we didn't even know that we were going to need, but we assumed that probably we were going to need things that we didn't even know what they were. So we wanted someone established that had the capacity to expand and to add various services that we didn't need them at the moment, but maybe we'll need them in a year, maybe we'll need them in 6 months, maybe in 3 years, you never know. And so we picked a big LSP. And then at some point, we still had freelancers, and we needed to change the model for one specific language for that we weren't happy with the quality of this language. Repeatedly, we tried all sorts of freelancers. We just weren't happy. We couldn't find the right people. And we were getting a lot of complaints from our in-market teams in that country. And so I went with a boutique LSP that specialized in this one language. And they were amazing. They did a great job at that. So then we thought maybe we can give them more languages because they're so good. And they struggled. They struggled with resourcing. So they never even started with us with the new languages because we were just too big and too crazy as a company. I don't want to say we broke them, but we definitely stressed their systems and their processes. We were too much as a company. We were too big, too crazy, too fast, too much volume, too many pivots. They were not used to someone of that size and with that type of operating ways. And so eventually I had to pull out from them and we had to streamline. And so we gave all the languages to the big LSP. And then we still weren't happy because they weren't flexible enough and they weren't coming up with innovative solutions. But our business, our needs had changed. While initially they were fine because I wanted someone stable who has a ton of capacity and can add services as I need. And it was fine for a few years. At that point, our team had become more sophisticated, more knowledgeable, knew better how to handle everything. And we were like, we want more innovation. We want more flexibility. We also need to save a little bit of money. They're charging us too much. Our procurement wasn't happy. And so we ran an RFP and we chose a different vendor that was smaller, but known to be incredibly flexible, open-minded, to come up with solutions that are ad hoc for you. And that's what we wanted. That's exactly what we wanted. Like I went out to companies and said, this is what I need. And I invited a few, and then I chose the one that was responding to that business needs. And so this is an example, like business needs change. And I think that vendors may be fine for a certain stage and not fine for another, and this is understood and needs to be accepted. It's not personal, it's business, baby, as they say, right? It's business, and it comes down to the business requirement. What are your needs for now? What is your roadmap for the next 3 years, if you can tell? 5 years ideally, but that's hard. Some environments can predict, some can't. And then base it on that. What are the current capabilities that you have inside versus outside? How much are you going to have to outsource? Do you want them to be incredibly embedded in your team, or you just want to keep them at arm's length? Do you expect other teams to want to use them directly? Are you okay with that? All of these questions are all questions that you need to ask yourself when you're sourcing a new vendor.
Yeah, I love that. And it sort of echoes some of the things that we talk about. You need a partner that can sort of grow with you and scale with you when you need to. But you also need, and you were sort of touching on this, you get to a point where your own localization maturity is at a point where you need a company that can bring some innovation to the table, can bring you those things that you maybe don't even know that you need, that help level up. And I think that's a great answer. Now, look, last question.
Okay.
Is there a topic that we haven't touched on, or is there something that you want to leave us with to think about, or any thoughts that you've got? It could be something we've spoken about or something completely new, but what would you like to leave us with as your last sort of thought on this episode, Giulia?
What a great question. I think that what I'd like to leave you with is that I think it's important to remain open and adaptable because we live in very volatile times. Things are changing all the time, significantly in the working world right now, technology and workplaces. And so I think that the people that ultimately will be okay and will not be absolutely floored by day-to-day anxiety are the ones who are willing to learn, to stay open and adaptable and learn and try out new things and keep an open mind with some critical thinking, obviously, to pair it with the open mind with the critical thinking. And they're going to be fine. I think that clinging to the past and the way things were is not it's it's I see a lot of like woe is me on LinkedIn where I spend a lot of time more than I should probably. And it's a little bit disconcerting to me because it seems to me I mean, I get it, it's a social media. What am I expecting, right? It's like socials are socials. It's like the worst of the worst all the time. But like, it would be good to have a little more like interesting conversations that are not like, oh my God, these companies are underpaying everybody and it's constant complaining. And it's like, all right. I think there's enough work for everybody to go around if we just keep an open mind, are collaborative, and are willing to learn and experiment new things instead of being like, trying to stay the way we were raised, the way we were taught when we went to school, all of that. That's my parting thoughts, basically.
It's a great thought to leave us with. I think that clinging to the past certainly doesn't sound like a recipe for success in the future. That's for sure. We can be mindful of where we've come from, but we do need to adapt. Yeah, thank you, Julia. And look, unfortunately, that brings me to the end of our conversation today on this episode of Vista Talks. I want to thank everybody who's been watching or listening to us around the world. I'm going to invite you back to watch another Vista Talks episode where we'll be discussing some more interesting topics with interesting people, just like Julia. But Julia, thank you for being on the show today. It's been wonderful to talk to you again.
Thank you so much for having me.